maybe I'll start with the question for Charlie. Your idea about going back to the making and the two ways that, the contrasting ways that the chisel were used in the ancient and the Renaissance sculpture, I think was suggestive. I suppose that you meant it to be suggestive in this context, certainly in relationship to what Michelle discussed, and then Scott a little bit about the possibilities of the contemporary technologies that Koons and by extension Katharina and you all use in varying degrees. If the making is the passage into these ancient works after their contextual particularities have, slipped out of our ability to identify them, can you say something about the contemporary technological process of making them and how they determine what's meaningful in your works? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah. But I'm not sure I can answer it, but it makes sense. But I don't know, I think it wasn't so much the making. I mean, to me, it's interesting to try as an artist to find something really simple, like, well, just where's the art part? What's the art part of this? Is it to me, much contemporary art is like folk art, and it doesn't matter. It's expressive. It's a little crazy. It has a huge support system. It's heavy on an idea. Always folk artists always have an idea that they're pushing out, and when the idea, which it will, falls away, what is left? And that's what I meant, I guess, by the making. And you can speculate that the Greeks or other cultures, had things that were artifacts that they looked at every day and put on their shelves, and we no longer can see them. They're debris or bits of rubble, but we can still see this. And I guess what I'm saying is I see it in not as an old thing, but as a really new thing, because because it's art, because it was made great. And I think that doesn't answer your question. I can tell by your expression on your face. But I think everybody approaches the making and the technological from a very different way. Like you can say, oh, well, Koons and Ray use machines and have a budget and they do this and they do that, but they can be, for very different, not even different reasons, but to different effects. I have a different maybe relationship, but it isn't a machine.
But do you, maybe even more specifically, do you think there are moments in your work in which the art part has come out of a technological process that is particular to your moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can begin trying to do something, so the only way you can do it, you hear, well, this machine will do that, or this company can do that. And then you go there, and people think, in a sense, it's like, make me this. And it doesn't work that way. So, you say, make me this, and they end up, the thing looking like this. And so but then you look at this and you go, well, that's kind of beautiful. And I like how these marks are. And it's like seeing what you can do, and it's a continual feedback loop of, I'm very interested in the hand of the machine. You can start out doing something, and later other things feed back into you, and this, you know, I told a friend recently, like, if you have enough time, the sculpture makes itself. You know, and you're looking at, but I guess that still doesn't answer, but.
No, that does, that's a yes.
Okay, yes.
So this is okay. So this is simply meant to be part of the answer, responding to the question for Charlie. As I would see it, I don't know that Charlie. Well, I know Charlie would agree with this because we've talked about it a lot. I mean, one place where you can really see that the issue of the making, with respect to Charlie's figurative sculptures, is in the stage of their material realization. Right? So there are many phases that they go through, years and years and years of the attempt to achieve a kind of perfection to the model. But then the crucial transition is the phase of material realization, where technological means are used. But there are many decisions that go into it. So it might be cast aluminum, or it might be machined aluminum, or it might be machined steel. And then the precise quality of, that's what Charlie was just describing. Something starts to be done, and you look at it, and you see the surface quality, and you see the effects. And there is, as Charlie has shown me, I mean, it is not predictable. It is not completely foreseeable. You're making your best call on the material realization. There have been times where Charlie has materially realized a piece in one final physical form and decided that it didn't work. And it had, and a whole other mode of material realization had to be taken up. So that would be the kind of making that would be crucial. But again, what I would want to emphasize, this is consistent with what I was saying, is the search for the perfection. I mean, that even though it's being realized materially by machines and technicians that and who didn't exist at some point in the fairly recent past, it's in the, and there's something called the hand of the machine, as Charlie describes it, but it's going to be monitored very closely by the artist in the interest of getting the thing exactly right, exactly the way he wants it. And it's this, in that sense, the saturation of the final product, however machined it may be, with something like the most intense and considered and almost like angstrom unit by angstrom unit form, modality of artistic intentionality, which makes the works ultimately art. I mean, what makes them art and gives them the quality they have is not some large-scale transformation from something to an image, if it's a representation that makes it art. No, what makes it art is incredibly focused, long-term artistic intentionality that went into making this thing just the way it is.
I don't quite agree with your emphasis, because I think it's, it's an important kind of pressure, but I think maybe the less obvious pressure is the way the hand of the machine does figure and become part of the way that he finds his particular perfection, which isn't the perfection of neoclassical sculpture, and isn't the perfection of...
No, of course not. I mean, but it's a medium. It's a medium of it's a medium, a vehicle for achieving a certain kind of art. Of course. I mean, if it were just simply a received, familiar, 100-year-old form of perfect, it would be like just neoclassic sculpture. It's not. In fact, the great difference from the neoclassic sculpture, the difference from the sculpture before, is precisely the way in which these technological means turn out in some way that isn't at all maybe like a priori evident at the start, to be the vehicle for the most fine-grained set of aesthetic discriminations that go into the making. So anyway, this has been my experience of those sculptures, and it's been, frankly, part of why I've, found them so compelling.
I mean, maybe that leads me to a question for you, Michael. Can you say something about why Charlie, who is a great lover of abstract high modernist sculpture, does not make abstract high modernist sculpture?
This is a hugely interesting question. It's one that Charlie and I have talked about. I mean, what would be the possibilities for where, I think, you might even say, well, it's the biggest challenge he faces. It's the biggest challenge he faces. Is there going to be a point in his career where he can find a way to make his way to something like an original form of radical abstraction? It's a really interesting intrigue. I can't simply answer it. I do want to say that I think in the larger sense, that's a really interesting question, one of the interesting questions that sculpture poses now. Because it's not simply a shift of taste, that produces some sort of turn to the figure. And again, I would say in Charlie, the figure becomes the vehicle for a certain mode of expressiveness and a certain mode of intentionality. And that was something, let's say, Caro was getting in a different way out of abstraction. And it's a real open question. I really don't know the answer. I think between them, Smith and Caro and certain other figures have used up a great deal of space. So that where one might have thought at a certain moment, I mean, forget the intervention of minimalism, at a certain moment, one might have thought, wow, this is just going to open into a huge area with just handling, with room for many, 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 many distinct, strong individualities. I mean, after all oil painting, representational oil painting involves is you've got a flat surface, often rectilinear, and you're painting a representational thing. Why should that have turned out to be an activity that could sustain and reward and reveal so many, thousands and thousands and thousands of distinct, powerful individualities? Wouldn't it stand to reason that, well, suddenly we're making sculpture by joining hunks of steel together? This is a completely new thing. Why didn't this turn into a continent? And it didn't. And I don't really know. I don't know the answer to that. But I think one reason it's worth posing the question is that it suggests that the door is open, at least in principle. It's not as if abstraction is simply in any way invalidated. That's one reason I wanted to emphasize the fact that as recently as this summer, there were a dozen new magisterial pieces of abstract sculpture in the world. Just an unbelievable achievement.
I mean, obviously my point in bringing the question up is not to call for a reclamation of high formless sculpture, but to suggest that there may be something, if our account of Charlie's work is going to be capacious enough, more that needs to be said about the relationship of the figural content to the abstract surface incidents. But so that's just to put that tension.
That's not. But I would want to say that's not. I wouldn't want to say that what I've just been saying is limited to that. I mean, we could talk a lot about the whole issue of the particular kind of effective relation between viewer and those sculptures. But I do think, let's just say, I think the question of abstraction is a really interesting one, and that it's good that it should be asked.
Thanks. Yeah, does this work? Yes. I have two questions, one to Michael and one to Scott. Michael, you mentioned a couple of terms in a row: postmodernism, interactive art, theatricality, and you said these things were appalling. I just would like to know why, if you could be a bit more precise about the reasons why you reject that so kind of vehemently. And I also have a question to Scott, because I found it interesting that you related Koons' work in particular to the tradition of the ready-made. And it made me think of John Roberts' book on the ready-made in relation to value. And what John Roberts says there is that the ready-made, say Duchamp's bottle rack, is an occasion where artistic labor is fusioned with social labor, because the bottle rack basically consists of the labor of others. It's not the artist's labor, it's the labor of others, and of other people who've actually made this work. But in Koons, basically there's a lot of labor getting into the recasting of these ready-mades, and in the same time, the labor that went into it is kind of obscured. Think of the balloon dog and its kind of perfect surface, no traces of labor there. We somehow know there's a lot of labor that was necessary to make this, but somehow the object obscures the labor that was invested into it. And an object that obscures the labor that was invested into it is usually called a fetish. So I was wondering if it would not make more sense to relate Koons' work to the tradition of the fetish than to the tradition of the ready-made.
Sorry. Yeah, I can speak to that. I mean, certainly I agree with you, and that has been a very strong strain in Koons's, in the reception of Koons, especially in the 80s, where a lot of critics, let's say in New York, were looking at Jeff's work and the rising market that was taking place around it and the kind of hype that was being generated around it, and this kind of conflation between the artwork as a kind of market fetish that was somehow aware of its own fetishization, if it was through its being reflective, let's say, or through its I don't know that Jeff per se was interested in any of this, but it doesn't matter. But that was part of certainly the discussion around his work at the time and other artists' work that he was exhibited with, like Ashley Bickerton, where you'd have an object that was increasing in value supposedly as clocked on the surface of the thing, which I would be curious to see what that number says today. But that I do think you're correct, and that's a very important line of discussion around Jeff's work.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be a large topic for me to really answer that question adequately. I'll just go back, and say that when I wrote Art and Object, when I wrote against minimalism, again, it was with a certain respect for minimalism. I thought it was wrong, because I thought it was going in a direction. I had no idea how right I was, okay? It didn't quite dawn on me that the next 30 years were going to be the justification for art and objecthood. And the art and objecthood was going to be in some ways marking a high watermark of high modernism for the time being. But I would take it seriously. I don't think it's great art, okay? I don't think Judd and Morris and Andre and Tony Smith are wonderful artists. I just don't think they are. I don't find them very particularly visually, sculpturally, whatever, aesthetically compelling to look at. But they embodied a certain theoretical position, certain theoretical stance, which played down the autonomy of the work of art. As Morris said, the work of it's not exactly that it becomes less important, but it's become less self-important now. Everything, the emphasis shifts towards the relations between the viewer and the work and the conditions of exhibition. Finally, it amounts to the constructing of certain situations. The whole emphasis falls. I could say that the work finally is displaced not only by the theatrical mise en scène in which it's placed, and minimalist art looked fantastic in galleries in the site. That was one of the first things that caught my attention about it. You'd enter into the gallery, and there might be a Judd and a Mark, whatever, and the gallery went hum. I mean, it hummed like a refrigerator. It really worked. It was plugged into the wall, so something was going on, but my own intuition was that it was something essentially ersatz, or let us say automatic, too easy, not high stakes. And that the whole emphasis finally on the viewer's experience, finally it's a kind of aesthetic of indeterminacy, which is part of a postmodern aesthetic. It's not a matter of what intentions go into the making of the work of art, it's the setting up of a kind of situation in which the meaning of the work is ultimately to be identified with the subjective experience of this person, this subject, that subject. So there's no question now of right or wrong, my experience, your experience. That is the work of art. And insofar as you would say in that essay that There's a sense that that's coming down the road. I thought that was wrong. When Tony Smith, in that quite electrifying piece of writing, talks about the experience of driving with some students at night on the unfinished Jersey Turnpike, and the feeling of this onrushing miles and miles of unilluminated road, and the whole kind of sublime experience of it. And he says, you couldn't put a frame around it. It was pretty clear to me that that marked the end of art. It's not that one doesn't understand that. It's not that it wouldn't have been, in some ways, thrilling and exalting to be in that car in that night, but it's the enemy position. It's the enemy. Okay? We don't want the end of art. It's drawing the wrong conclusion from a terrific ride on an unfinished turnpike. Okay? Enjoy it, you know, but don't think it marks the end of art. The attempt with art and object was to draw a certain line in the sand and say, all of this is, with respect to, you might say, theory, deeply wrong, and will have only wrong consequences in art as proved to be the case.
Okay. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on your question, Isabella. I think what I see is not an answer, but a point, is the idea of the labor and the obscured labor. And I agree with you and don't. I think when I look at the Brancusi bunny, I see and feel the labor as compression. And I feel it's this great celebratory moment of perfection, all this labor. And of course, it's nowhere near the labor of later works, but it's still a lot of labor. It's a good stand-in for labor, all that shining and fixing. And so this bunny comes out as boing, super, and the labor to me is not obscured, because just quite frankly, you know how it had to be made. And I see maybe your point a little more in the later works, almost as masturbatory, where they become continual. And you know, maybe for me, not the balloon dogs so much, but some of the proliferation of other works. I could understand the lose as maybe a sense of compression for me. And I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say in terms of labor being seen, even if it's not visible as a physical mark. It's still visible as a red quality and as a sculptural element in the work.
Well, of course we know that a lot of labor went into these works, but in the same time, the traces of labor are kind of obscured.
That's what I'm trying to address.
And I would even go further, and I say that I think Koons' work, and I think that's interesting, they suggest somewhat that they made themselves. There's a kind of suggestion of self-agency. And if you say that, you know, you talked about the Brancusi as condensating labor, as kind of, you know, as that it gives you the impression as if labor was compressed in it. That's also interesting, considering that Marx defined value as compressed labor. You know, so I think we also ought not only to think about these works as if they existed as such, as if they had a clear-cut frame, because I think art doesn't never end at its frame, and the border between what's inside art and what is supposedly outside art is per se fluid and unstable. And therefore I think that we ought to, when we think about these characteristics of sculpture, it's also interesting not to forget value, and not in the simple sense of how much does it cost, but in the sense of the aesthetic and economic worth that is attributed to a work of art, that is somewhat related to the labor question.
Well, related to the piece, but I was addressing not the, you know, I would agree with you that there isn't a boundary, and there is no inside and there is no outside, and looking at a work you can fall through it and see its relationship. But what I was trying to say is some of the pieces, no matter how much labor that they have in, they don't fetishize, because what I was trying to say is by the compressed labor, was that because it didn't have like a expressive mark of a grinder or of labor or of a trace of a hand, that I still see and celebrate the labor that was invested in it. And I think that it's not accidental. I think, and somehow what's great about that piece is that's what one of the things that happens with it for me.
Because I think, I don't know if this is on, we have to distinguish between different types of labor as well. And I'd be really curious to hear, this is one of the questions that I had also for you, Charlie, but it relates a bit to the discussion of intention as well. So for example, when you have spoken about Hinoki, I think that you have cited sort of the marvelous combination, and you alluded to this as well, Michael, the combination of the marks on this tree trunk as it was found that occurred naturally, the marks that it acquired in the transit of you finding it and taking it away, it gets sort of affected by that, and then the marks of finally this incredibly complicated process that it took to realize the replica via hand carving, and that it had all of these sort of palimpsests of indexes of different types of marks and different types of labor and events. In the same, or not in the same way, but in another register, Koons is very interesting because if you look at the wax figure, the gorilla wax figure, he wants to capture the very imperfect, irregular, jagged seams that occur when that original wax toy that he modeled it on was made by a crude industrial process. So it's sort of funny to me. I wonder when either Jeff Koons or you, Charlie, when you decide to include vestiges of the hand, or when you potentially efface them.
Well, it's always, and it's one can give something to fabricators and to machines and to different technologies, and one can work with them. I work very close with my fabricators, and what they can do, with their hands, with their minds. With their problem-solving abilities, it's my decision in the end what to do with it. The hand in Hinoki was. I think we just turn this off.
Jack, do you want to give me your mic so
Give me her. Now I feel very self-conscious about talking. So maybe I'll end. Did that answer your question?
Well, it was curious.
I mean, when you look at Hinoki, you can see there's passages in it of someone who was, obviously Thursday afternoon and super bored, and almost making like crisscross marks.
Right.
And there's other exquisite passages through it, and you can actually see the intent of many different peoples and types of hands, but. I once asked my wife, Sylvia Gaspardo Moro, I said, is all of this was on another work, being lost in subtlety? This stuff is just so what we're struggling over, so subtle. She said, yeah, it's like really subtle, but the meaning is in the subtleties, in between the subtleties. And, those are, time is a really beautiful thing. And thinking about distance, temporal distance is really beautiful. We don't know who made the ego fell apart, but the things that I do, I kind of have the final call, but they're super collaborative efforts with fabricators, with relationships with other people in factories, convincing them to do the work, that it's a viable thing instead of working on an airplane, and all these things, and then actually the feedback of what they can do, what that means to the object that you're making, and what that might not just mean, in a sense, it's funny to say it like this, but not just today, but what it means, just getting it right. I always start with an idea, what I think the thing is about. Usually that changes a few times while I'm working on it. It's a very shallow is the wrong word, but it's a very easy, you know, there's a meta project kind of going on, and sometimes it's almost cultural, much greater than just me.
I just want to make a kind of, what you just asked, Charlie, made me think of another sort of triangle around what Isabelle had asked before, too, which is interesting to me, is that I mean, we're speaking about an artist like Jeff and sometimes Charlie as though there's like whatever their most recent work is the way that they make things, or that there's this kind of one way of making things. And there's a whole series of Jeff's, the banality pieces from the 80s, which I didn't show many of, in fact, because they're not based really on ready-mades, where he would go to wood carvers and porcelain makers in Europe, and they signed the sculptures, and Jeff didn't. And there was also a lot of hand in them. There's a kind of facture of the wood surfaces that had been chiseled. And I've always thought that was, I don't want to say funny, but interesting to me about that is that the time where he allowed the sculpture to be signed on the surface, not by him, but by anyone making it, that was part of his discussion around kitsch in a way, that the evidence of that labor or of handicraft was almost like an embarrassing thing that isn't what he thought maybe art was supposed to look like in 1986, even though he was making art that looked like that, or in 1988. So it's not that all of these objects have the same kinds of surfaces and the same relationship to their fabrication. There's so many different chapters in Jeff's work and Charlie's work and all of their works.
It's not necessarily a progression either, you know, trying to get it, you know, closer and closer to this ideal. You know, it's the ideal, or the art part, if you will, does develop, but not necessarily the fabrication techniques aren't the thing that's developing.
Well, it was interesting too, because I think one of the things about Jeff's work in The New, which is one of the first series with the vacuum cleaners, is that I think people usually just assume that these are vacuum cleaners he sourced and just put on in these cases. But in fact, he, you know, says that he actually would tweak a vacuum fan. He would tweak little components within them to make them more perfect, whatever that means. That he didn't just order the plexiglass cut, he ordered it rough cut and then precision cut it himself by hand so he could get the right joints, the right seams. And that's very early on. Then much later, well now, it's very curious because with the painting, for example, the paintings are absolutely incredibly intricate. The process is very convoluted. Much of it is extremely mechanized with these hundreds of assistants applying the hues. But at the end now, and it's been different over time, Scott knows this better than I do, someone goes over it by hand again. And that's obviously very important to him. And this is a very strange sort of circle.
Well, also, I would just say, it interests me what you were talking about in relation to Michael's idea about this kind of density of intention, is that there's a lot of these objects that seem not to have that sense of density, maybe that Michael's seeing in Hinoki, have a tremendous amount of it, maybe not exactly in their making, but in their conceptual density, in the way that, I don't know, to find a certain kind of poster, Jeff would fly across the country and convince someone to give him something, and that becomes I would question, I don't think I perceive that density of intention as an absolute positive value necessarily in anyone's art, but I would say that there are different maybe ways of finding traces of it.
But I must say I'm kind of surprised that we accord so much belief to what an artist said, how he did something, or what he meant. I mean, isn't it clear, since at least the Duchamp, I would say, that this would mean to fall for an intentionalist fallacy, to believe that the truth of the meaning of an artwork can be found in the artist's statement about it, or in the way he seemingly produced it. I mean, is that really where we believe we find the meaning of an artwork? I mean, Duchamp, for that matter, he already talked about what he called an artistic coefficient, and thereby meant that what an artist intended is not necessarily what the work will look like or what the work is about. There's a huge gap between the two. So why are we so fixated on, you know, what the artist thought or how he did it? And why is there this intention fixation around this table? But maybe I'm imagining it.
Because I'm here, they have to be nice.
No. The intentionalist fallacy is a bad essay. I mean, it's wrong. It's wrong. So here, oh yeah, and remember to stress that a work of art is a realization of artistic intention is not to posit a previous intention which is then systematically realized in the work of art. It's much more the kind of dynamic that Charlie is describing, where you might say the intention changes and is modified and is constantly dialectically interacting with the writing, with the making, with the producing, with the painting. But in the end, what's being produced, if it's a work of art, is a profoundly intentional artifact. And that as Charlie's conversation with his wife, Sylvia, is it getting too refined? Is this too refined? She says no, because the meaning is there. The meaning is there. The meaning is the realization of the intentions as they work through the work, as they are modified in the making. But here, on a theoretical level, I would say it'd be worth reading Walter Ben Michaels' book, The Shape of the Signifier, 1967, to the End of History, and all sorts of other essays and writings that could be found in the online journal nonsite.org. But one of the things that deeply encourages me about this moment in time is not that there are certain works of art and artists in whom I can once again believe and whose work I can admire, but that I think theoretically things are coming right. Things are coming right, and all sorts of mistakes that have ruled the roost theoretically for a long time their cell date is past. But that's a large topic.
I just want to say also that I don't think that we are speaking, I mean, in Jeff's case, he didn't particularly want an essay in his catalog about the way that things are made. In fact, if we were talking about what he says about his work, we'd be talking about love and trust and support and sexuality, and I want to make you accept yourself the way I accept myself, and I want this object to support you and your feelings about your community. And so, I mean, that's fine too, and that's a different essay. But what I find interesting to me is the kind of disconnect between his conversation or parole around his work and then all of the things that I'm aware of, these decisions that Charlie or Michael are speaking about that are happening on a daily basis, 9 million times a day in that studio, that he would not efface, he will acknowledge them if you ask them, he's not hiding them, but he would act like, oh, that's just the means to some other kind of end, which has to do with my kidnapped son. And so, you know, I don't think that I'm speaking about his work maybe in kind of the way that you would suggest that I was, in terms of his, like a one-to-one relationship between what he says and what I see in it. I don't think that's the case.
So I think that the question of intentionality is obviously a very complex one, and it was interesting when Charlie talked about how he learned to talk to girls in the movies. And so the question of what it means to not only adopt or engage with the ready-made object, but what it means to engage with the ready-made gesture, or the notion of an experience that is in some ways already fashioned for us. And that actually does touch, I think, a lot on what you were discussing, Isabelle.
One question for Isabelle. At the end of your talk, when you signed off with a connection between, liveliness or merit and value in the new economy, in your new economy.
My new economy.
Your new economy, well, which you derived from
it all by myself.
a lot of other famous theorists.
You're in a different economy.
but
I like that.
but one thing that I'm just genuinely curious at that moment is, for example, you made a distinction. I'm not going to be able to rehearse it exactly, but between the replica, and I think that was the one moment when you nodded to Charlie in making a contrast with the sculptures that you used as your examples. But something that I'm wondering is the works that you find productive or valuable to yourself in this whole broader symptomatic situation that you describe. Can you say something about that? Because one thing that I'm wondering, and it's too grand of a choice of words for what I'm saying, but I'm wondering, when we're talking about the return of the figure, or even a return to figuration, which is maybe a more simple idea, is that these possibilities are not maybe fixed, but they sort of almost modulate dialectically, so that something that was falling on the side of a literal replica at one moment may be a vehicle for possibilities at another one. I don't know if I'm saying enough, but I guess I want you to say more about what kind of art is viable given that paradigm.
Yeah, I would be very hesitant to be prescriptive at this point and to say, you know, what art should do. But I was referring to the necessity to distinguish between two types of anthropomorphism. And I think it's an important distinction that one has to distinguish between those works that are anthropomorphic because they invite us to read the traits of a human being into a non-human thing. And this would be like Rachel Harrison or Isa Gensken, or those works that literally present replicas of the human figure. And here my example was Charles Ray. There could be many other examples. I just think it's important because the word anthropomorphism is often used in a kind of unclear fashion. You know, I think what I was genuinely interested in when starting to think about this return of the human figure was, for instance, to find out why is there such a conjunctures of mannequins in art installations now? Why, you know, what is it in the, say, last 10 years that triggered this? And then I was thinking about the mannequin as this weird hybrid between a person and a product, a kind of personalized product, something seemingly alive and definitely not alive in the same time.
Do you mean a loose figurative sculpture or a mannequin?
A mannequin, and
you know, very,
like the works I showed, you know, like in Thomas, there are rules about them.
Very specific.
Okay.
And they're about.
You should talk to the mic.
The rules were developed in the early 60s, late 50s by Sears. If you note, what we kind of think is the uncanny and all that, our older mannequins are paper mache.
But what about surrealist mannequins?
Those are paper mache. And for instance, like the mannequins that I got interested in, I wasn't making bad figurative sculptures. I was making sculptures of mannequins. And I was interested in mannequins in the late 80s as a contemporary figuration. The rules are in a book called the Sears Standard. And you know, all the proportions, it's an industry rum line. And like a mannequin, eyes are wide because it can never have eye contact with you. Mannequin can never smile. And the reason for this is because if a mannequin smiles, it's not only demonic, but it has its own personality, and you can't project yourself into wearing the clothes. Mm-hmm. So
yes, and
that's why I'm asking if you were talking about mannequins or people using them as kind of stand-in figures to populate an installation.
I was speaking about artworks that use mannequins in different ways. I was not distinguishing now between all the different ways in which you can use a mannequin. I was just thinking there's so many artworks in the last 10 years where mannequins appear that I wondered why. And I started thinking about the mannequin, and I started thinking about what kind of sensation does it provide. And it does provide a sensation of aliveness whilst being dead. And that, you know, and I wondered if this could have something to do with the so-called new spirit of capitalism, which also values aliveness and vitality very much.
Yeah, I see it more just as bad art in a way, often as a stand-in for a figuration, as a quick and easy figuration. I shouldn't say bad art because I haven't seen a lot of them, but it can be a very, you know, ready figuration in a way. I mean, I asked about mannequins because just in the general literature from the 90s and the 2000s, I noticed everything started to be called mannequins. Even a Dwayne Hansen, there would be critical essays on Hansen, and they'd be calling his work mannequins.
No, I mean ready-made mannequins that are used in different types of installations, which I showed, from Thomas Hirschhorn to Heimo Zobernick. Yeah. Anyway, and just to say one last thing on your question, what was also important to me was to introduce value into the recent conjuncture of discourses on animation. There, at least in Europe, have been a lot of exhibitions on animation. There has been a big reception of Latour's work. There have been speculative realism, which in a different way is interested in the animated object. And I thought that there was one blind spot in these discussions about animation, which is value. Because for value to emerge, there needs to be for something to be valuable, it needs to be animated. And this has to do with the fact that, you know, value consists of something alive, lived labor. And I was intrigued by thinking about, I wanted to find out whether the conjuncture of these types of works and their desirability might have something to do with the way they are considered valuable, with that specific value form. So, yeah, I hope this is clear.
This is a question, I mean, it's not a question addressed at anybody, but it simply takes off from the fact that none of us has spoken of Katharina Fritsch. And I'm just wondering, is there anyone here who has something? I mean, I actually loved seeing the blue cock in London. I thought it looked great there. It's a body of work that I've never found it easy to come to terms with, so just doing some homework for this occasion. I came across a very interesting essay by Jean-Pierre Criqui, who admires her work a lot. And so I'm finding her interesting. I don't have anything myself of interest to say, but I'm in a learning mode. So I'm just wondering, is there anything anyone has to say here about Fritsch?
I would say I talked to Jack about this a while ago, from the late 80s, The Ghost and The Pool of Blood are a big turning point for a lot, at least for me. I mean, very influential. I was really happy it's in the show.
Can you say something about the qualities of that work in that moment? That
no, I just recognize. It's just something I recognize as a kind of ancestor. Like you see someone, you realize that's Jesus, that's my uncle. And you didn't know it. When you first met it. It has to do with the figuration, the puddle, the relationship between the ghost and the blood. There's just a lot, the surface, the fabrication of it. And I think it was a really, really important work.
Yes, should open it to the floor. People aren't too tired at this point.
No, we've got mics.
Should I wait for a mic then? Yeah.
There's been a fair, hello, good evening. Thank you for a very interesting panel. I just wanted to ask the panelists if they could perhaps reflect a little bit on not only the relations of production and labor, which has been discussed, but also the conditions of reception and the economy of production, because it seems to me that the kind of labor-intensive, studio-based fabrication that we're discussing could really not exist without an enormous amount of capital investment and a very particular kind of market for the work. And just to sort of put that out there, it does seem to me that although we're talking about this work in the context of the sort of return to figuration at the contemporary moment, there also seems to be a return to a pre-modern or at least pre-social democratic modes of production in these highly capital-intensive modes of studio production that belong perhaps instead to an era of aristocratic and patronage, which would seem to correspond with the contemporary art market very well, where we have a field of collectors dominated by oligarchs and aristocrats. So it would seem interesting to link those circumstances to the return of figuration and even sort of classical figuration in many of the works that we're talking about.
I would agree with you that the works, some of the works that we've been talking about tonight require a great capital investment to produce in terms of their fabrication. I don't see that as being something that's necessarily linked to figuration per se. I think there's a lot of kinds of works like big sculptures by Anish Kapoor or something that cost a lot of money to make and that are abstract and require what you're describing as a kind of pre-modern patronage form, just as there are a lot of other works like a painting by Bryce Mardner, Cy Twombly, that end up with a value in a marketplace that's equivalent to, let's say, that of a Jeff Koons, that are not about the figure. So I don't see a direct connection there, either on the side of those things that require a lot of production involvement, nor those that don't, in terms of that value. But
yeah, thanks for that question. I think that especially in Koons' case, you know, the production costs were so high that at some point during the production of Celebrations, most of his gallerists were nearly going bankrupt because of the kind of pre-investments they had done. So you definitely need support of very wealthy gallerists and collectors in order to be able to produce this type of work. But I would also say that the same is true for a couple of artists whose work consists in immaterial labor. If you think, for instance, of someone like Olafur Eliasson and his factory type situation in Berlin, where he hires in-house art historians to do research and so on and so forth, there's a lot of money needed for this type of production as well, but it's much less material. Yeah, but I think Eliasson is even more expensive for that matter, but yeah.
There's somebody right there, I think.
I guess just hearing Michelle and Scott's presentations that were mostly about Koons, and they both sort of ended, one with the future and one with the contemporary, and they were both kind of valedictory endings. You know, it's like is this the future of production, or the work is contemporary? That was just sort of factually how they ended in words. And I was thinking that it seems strange that like a kind of extensive discussion of production going through how these forms work would end up sort of talking about how the work treats the time it's in, either projects itself forward or renews itself in the moment. And it seemed like the work shouldn't be, it should be one or the other. I don't know, maybe that's a...
Oh, you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I wasn't actually meaning to say talk about the work's relationship to a production of its time, although I think that's an interesting question and one that is related to all three of those artists. I was more kind of responding to Jack's question, and that's kind of why I showed these other figurative sculptures, which was to say, if I sort of accept that there's not really a return to figuration, there's always been figurative sculpture. It's more like what would have happened to figurative sculpture. It's not what happened to us to make figurative sculpture suddenly look okay. It's what happened to figurative sculpture that it could suddenly seem like contemporary art in the eyes of the people at this table or in this room. So I was just positing kind of one thought about that, which had to do with the way that the figure got, let's say, reread through the ready-made, but I have other thoughts about that. So I don't mean, I think I just wanted to kind of clarify, maybe it's something that wasn't clear in my talk, that was about kind of how these works could become, how this way of positing a figure in sculpture could become amenable to a certain kind of discourse, really. It's not like suddenly now we all think George Siegel's okay. It's what happened that made Katharina Fritsch okay and not George Siegel. It's not like we've gone back and accepted those things. They're still problematic for a lot of people. But where did these sculptures or sculptors learn lessons from or adapt their way of working to? Not that they did it in a kind of, like they were trying to do that on purpose, but that's just, I wanted to clarify where I was coming from.
Yeah, by valedictory you mean sad, right? Or do you actually mean valorizing that?
I guess relative to your presentation, which is where I was just more surprised by the abruptness of the ending, because I was following and very interested in the analysis of the switch between kind of 3D scanning to the mapping, where you see inside the object. And I was personally thinking about the relationship of that kind of looking, maybe correctly or not, I would say like that degree of control over all of the voxels or the data points. It's a kind of sort of forensic way of approaching the thing that you're working with. You kind of can identify every part of it in every moment. And I thought that there's a kind of, I don't know, that one could locate that socially and think about kind of what the work means relative to that, but I don't know, I didn't quite, I felt like the ending, you talked a lot about the production, but I didn't quite understand how it established the stakes of the work. And I felt like ending with a time instead of addressing the stakes struck me as odd.
Well, I guess I exceeded my 10 minutes, but I still did not illuminate. I think the stakes are very much in terms of this very paradoxical conjunction of serial reproduction and a different kind of idiosyncratic singular production, which in fact, it's very paradoxical because it relates, in fact, it's a strange convergence of this kind of artisanal hand, the immediacy of the hand, and new, in fact, digital or digitally mediated ways of also achieving this kind of immediacy or these kinds of, in fact, irregular forms. And I think one thing that's maybe interesting in this light is the relationship to notions of objectivity. And in fact, I was struck by the way Koons, again, his rhetoric, which is very bizarre, he talks about this kind of replication as a moral exercise. And we can, laugh or smile wryly at that or just say it's this reactionary thing. But what was interesting to me was that, in fact, notions of mechanical objectivity in the 19th century were very much about this paradoxical conjunction of valorizing the machine, the new type of recording. The machine was, in fact, much better than the hand, and that to the degree that even if you were looking at a very fuzzy X-ray that was sort of unintelligible, that was more accurate, more objective, better, more truthful, and more honest than a verisimilar hand drawing. So very strangely, you have these conjunctions of the new mechanical world somehow being more faithful or true to nature, and they gave that a moral component. So I found that very interesting in terms of Jeff's work and also his rhetoric around objectivity. It relates in the past to the past in that way as well, and that's part of the stakes, which is that it obviously connects to this entire nexus of morality, economy, et cetera, but those have to be defined very much in terms of historical specificity of the moment now, and I was trying to get at all of those registers, I guess.
There's somebody right down here.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. I was struck by the example of Hirshhorn that you used, Isabel, and one thing that I was thinking was, is there a difference between populating an installation with mannequins and then making the sorts of sculptures that will be in this show. And one thing that I thought of was how little anyone really touched on installation, particularly like the dominant forms of installation in the 90s, and whether that has made a difference at all to how we see sculpture now. Whereas we've been talking a lot about minimalism and the ready-made and abstraction and figuration. Does the form of installation matter? Does it not at all? Does it change how we look at sculpture now? If that makes any sense to any of you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, when I was sitting here, I was thinking about Peter Osborne's claim that contemporary art is post-conceptual art, and I wondered if this is true. Because for Peter Osborne, it is totally understood that art is in a kind of intermedium condition, as he calls it, and and that of course artists operate with installation. I think I said in the beginning of my talk that I won't do justice to each of the works, and that I just kind of functionalize them slightly as examples. But of course it makes a difference how a mannequin appears, and if it appears in an installation or if it comes, as a how can I say, solitary figure. It doesn't really make a difference for my argument, though, because I'm more interested in the general observation that there are mannequins, and lots of them in different guises, in installations or not, and that this might have something to do with the type of celebrity culture we live in, and this celebrity culture asks us persons to become like products, and is very interested in products who behave like persons. So I wonder if there's a connection between this celebrity culture type economy we live in and the affluence of mannequins who, you're right, appear in different guises.
I mean, more generally speaking, the whole pressure of installation art, I mean, in a funny way, it just becomes about where you put the frame. And one of the particularities, I think, of the three artists that we're looking at, and one of the sort of quandaries or perplexities about the show is, what does it mean that in the aftermath of 20 years of interdisciplinary experiment that might have initially been more ideologically and conceptually motivated, but that may have institutionalized itself as just a kind of, more theatrical use of the white cube. I mean, how do we think about these artists who have sort of put that aside and decided that they're going to draw the frame in a more traditional way, or relate to the pedestal in a more traditional way? Somehow, the pressures of those innovations must circulate back into what is obviously a particular decision by sophisticated people like this.
I would say, Jack, to that, that's interesting to me, and a kind of a point of distinction and joining of the different artists is that, like, I think that Charlie's work and Katharina's especially is dependent on a kind of installation context, even if we're talking about a discrete figure, or I imagine that they think a lot about that. I know Katharina does, I've talked about it with her, in terms of how much actual physical space is around the object, is required by that object. The relationship between often one of her sculptures and the backdrop that she might create for it. That even though those might not be a part of the work, like you get this diagram that's given to you, that there's very specific ideas about how those works live in space. I don't think Jeff has that, actually. I think that he's sort of, we're on the record, not a great, actually, as an installation maker. I think that he really thinks about objects, and then he either installs them well or doesn't, or other people do. But I think that those objects that have, in some sense, internalized other logics that would be hard to describe. I have to think about it more.
I would agree with that, and still there's a kind of, probably some distinction to be made for an artist to be sensitive and highly attuned to the conditions of the installation of a singular object and what we kind of mean when we say installation art as a...
Yeah, I mean, all these are not all or nothing, categories. I mean, I think we're all in agreement about that. So even just hanging a traditional painting on the wall means you want to get all sorts of conditions right in order for it to, in order for you to pay no attention to those conditions, you might say. And part of the genius of early minimalism, of the sort of work from the 60s, is just how stunning those installations were. I mean, it was like installation before installation art as a specific medium or genre. The galleries really looked extraordinary. I mean, the construction of those situations was extraordinary, but in a funny way. I mean, again, by my lights, it also devalued the work of art in certain ways and put the whole emphasis on the situation and a certain mode of experiencing. What one sees now, I mean, with respect to this art, or let's say with respect to Charlie's art, how the work is exhibited matters a lot. I actually think Charlie is a terrific installer of his own work when I see the last shows at Matthews, Marks, and so on. And it's a very subtle thing. It's a very subtle thing because you walk into a large space and there are 3 pieces, and the space as a whole looks good, but the emphasis, I mean, the entire point of the placement of the sculptures, you could say the entire point of the installing of them, is to allow you to focus with enormous concentration on one piece at a time, which goes to what you were saying. So they're not physically isolated from each other exactly, but they're placed in such a way that they allow for an extraordinarily prolonged and focused and concentration on each piece individually. So it's a very, I mean, you would agree with that. I'm not, this isn't news.
No,
it's a subtle business
I think
how to do it.
nothing that I'm doing. I think the 20th century collage and different aspects, we've lost, just an eye, a visualization. And
It's every time you talk, you realize.
It's your voice in particular.
All that time is spent around machines grinding steel.
Yeah.
This is the new subject.
But it's I see it as common sense. I see it just as let's put them in the room and put them in their proper place. And it's just it seems that there's been a real loss in an ability to do that. And I don't, you can speculate endlessly on culture, on the computer, on all the banner stuff on the internet, and just, the way we sell things. But I find it, it was a criticism of, we were talking a little today, it was a criticism Hyde gave of Carl, of the delicateness of the work from the 60s, needing, clean space behind it. And that it, and what Michelangelo said, you got to make a sculpture so you can roll it down a hill and not have the arms break off. And it's something I think about all the time. Just what's the arms today? What's the hill? Where is the hill? It's not. You don't have to take it literally, but I see it very problematically when I'm faced with that, and then I turn and see what happens in museums when you leave. For instance, the Boy with Frog. As soon as I left, looks like a Damien Hirst. They put a glass case over it. And I spent my whole career embedding something in space and time and not using a pictorial effect. A glass case is a picture. You look in it. It's also for contemporary festival type of things like the biennial. It's very convenient because the work can't be damaged. It works very well. But so those kinds of things are it's something I think about all the time. How do I subvert that? How do you make work more dynamic without caving into it too? Without quote unquote like electrifying it, or having a punishment built into it or something, or an automatic way, but just one that can stand up to it more and do what I want to do. So but I think
something shifting. But I see it, the installing work as common sense. It's just, take some time, you go in, give yourself a couple of days, put the stuff, don't be fussy about it, just get it to look right. But, not very many people can do it.
Maybe one final question?
Maybe towards the end I can say something.
Okay.
But more like a few remarks, and it's funny that we're anticipating an exhibition far away in Stockholm, and the only other dialogue between Pasadena and Stockholm that I'm aware of is in 1963 when the Stockholm version of the Duchamp glass was shown here, and Duchamp was playing chess with a naked lady in front of it, and some of the ready-mades were shown here also. And ready-mades, the Duchamp ready-mades aren't really ready-mades. I mean, some of them, like think about Why Not Sneeze or something. They're not just objects that are produced and mass-produced and then exhibited in a different way. But that maybe leads in the wrong direction. But I feel the way that Jack introduced the whole conversation, and also some of you, especially Scott, discussed it, had to do with how we move through the ready-made and beyond the ready-made. And we got some hints, and maybe I presume in Michael's case that it's simply that we get out of that whole game and that we go back to something more meaningful. And in Isabelle's case, I guess because the ready-mades, they belonged in the Duchampian version to a totally different financial system and a different economy. And our ready-mades, if that's the right word, are simply different. And they're not objects, they're maybe semi-subjects or something. And it seems like all of you actually were close to that. And I don't know, Jack, if you're happy with these answers, because this is part of the conversation that will somehow contextualize the show that you're doing. And I can't now ask you to say, what do you think? Are we going to move beyond the ready-made, and in what way? Maybe the show will answer that, unless one of you, or Jack, you yourself, wants to say something, some last remark about that, because I think Scott, for instance, also talked about it, but it was more that, a little hint that the ready-made was a vehicle, a way to reintroduce certain things, figuration, etc. But it wasn't so much about how we maybe go beyond it, unless, Duchamp claimed he was indifferent, but I don't believe that at all. He kept going on about the same objects and reintroduced them in small versions in his boxes, and that I think is trusting too much what he said. But so maybe the show will be the answer. But still, how are we moving beyond the ready-made?
Well, I mean, I think for me, when I'm looking at these three artists, I don't really want to say finally that they're about the ready-made, but I think that the logic of the ready-made is in a way enfolded into these works in I mean, various and complicated ways. I mean, is something from Jeff Koons or Katharina Fritsch for that matter, a souvenir Madonna that we recognize as such, but that is subject to transformations in scale and facture, a kind of, coated, highly saturated, powder-like surface. I mean, I suppose maybe, is that enough of an answer? I don't think it's a question about whether we're returning to the ready-made or moving away from the ready-made. But that what we learn from the ready-made is a part of the way these works function.
Yeah, I would just say too that I don't think any of these artists actually use the ready-made per se. The only thing I can think of just sitting here is maybe Jeff Koons' Nike posters are that, where he went and he framed them, so I don't know if that counts or not, but that's the closest that any of these artists gets to that. And also, they all make a lot of art that has very little to do with the ready-made. A lot of Charlie's recent sculptures, whether it's the Young Man, I don't know if that's the right title, the Balloon Dog is not based on a ready-made, nor are any of the sculptures from Banality. They might look like things that we know, but when I was, maybe that overemphasized my feelings about this topic was really looking at each of these artists at a certain moment in their work, maybe before they'd made something that looked like a figurative sculpture. They'd made other things. Jeff had made surrealist paintings, and Charlie had made activities where he, dressed himself up in his different clothes, and we could talk about the relationship of photography to his figurative sculpture. That could be a whole nother paper, or in Jeff's case, but that what might have kind of been a sort of passage that had a kind of purchase or lever on them maybe in the mid-'80s, that they all happened to engage with these ready-made things, but I don't think they're stuck there. I think many of the objects in the show, as I understand them, fall outside of that. It was more as a kind of needle that maybe got passed through, where then that led to representation in Jeff's case, and then maybe it led him to even a figure. His first figurative sculpture was the little golfer caddy for the bar set that happened to be a figure in the same sculpture that he was showing glasses and pails. So I don't mean to make that like a totalizing kind of gesture at all.
Right. I mean, I think, Daniel, that you're precisely right in saying that maybe the emphasis on the ready-made tonight was just a circumstance of the occasion than the 10-minute speeches and where we happen to go. Because, for example, one could have talked of the relationship of kitsch and the idea about populism and the audience vis-a-vis our relationship to mass media culture as a way to access, for example, the way a Katharina Fritsch exists between some kind of almost archetype and cliche, almost comic book archetype with figures like the ghost and pool of blood, or the the assisted Madonnas. So in a way,
about Botero and Stuart Johnson too. Like, I mean, if you wanted to talk about kitsch and figurative sculptures and other triangles that you could make.
And the discussion about kitsch and how that accesses questions about the audience and populism could lead to the fact that these three artists have also invested the whole notion of public sculpture. Public sculpture, maybe for sophisticated people like the ones on this panel, is something that is a slightly kind of demonized mode of operation. We associate it with town squares and bad commissions, but these artists have all also engaged the whole idea about what a public sculpture can be and manipulated that in very particular ways. So, I mean, I think the ready-made maybe was overprivileged as, one facet of which we could have picked 4 or 5, gone from there.
Yeah, but I thought it was intriguing that Daniel mentioned Duchamp's chess-playing performance, because for me, Duchamp is the artist, among others, who intuited the commodification of the person. In a way, Duchamp, in his many performances, and in the way that he cultivated a persona, I think there is an awareness about how persons get commodified and become ready-made-like. And for me, Jeff Koons is an artist who took this this one step further, this commodification of the person. When you think, for instance, of his advertisement series in the 80s, which accompanied the banality shows, or if you think of Made in Heaven, where it's all about, selling his persona as a product. I only think that with Jeff Koons, we have to distinguish, say, between the 80s and 90s, where this type of, this kind of readiness to sell yourself was a provocation to an art world which was very attached to notions of distance and criticality, and his readiness nowadays to smile into every camera and to completely cooperate, with the laws of celebrity culture, which wants us to perform ourselves, which is precisely what he does. So it has kind of lost its edge for me. While I find, the advertisement series in the 80s really interesting, I find the way in which he exposes his bedroom in the New York Times magazine not that challenging, but just kind of basically following basically what he does now by embracing the laws of celebrity culture is, losing the potential of provocation that his work had for me in the 80s.
I just wanted to add to this because I think part of the reason the ready-made has been central, whether it's by contingency or by design, is because we're talking about sculpture, and in specificity in terms of 20th century sculpture, the sculptural object was immediately having to deal with the commodity object. And what's been so interesting about, I think, all of the artists who you're including in this show is that they are challenging in some ways how we understand the commodity as a material or as an object, and what it means to move out of, let's say, 19th and 20th century definitions of what a commodity object is.
Maybe that's good. That sounded decisive.